The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, says the world will soon get a glimpse of what he called a new strategic weapon.
I know he's sending out certain messages about Christmas presents, and I hope his Christmas present is a beautiful vase. That's what I'd like, a vase. You think it will be, sir? As opposed to something else.
Tracking anti-government protests in Hong Kong. Voicing concern about China's treatment of its Uyghur Muslims. Looking at the ruling party's domestic and foreign policies. Work carried out by human rights groups. Now, a cybersecurity firm claims cyber spies have targeted a number of these NGOs. In a new report, SecureWorks alleges the culprits are likely linked to the Chinese state.
Based on the information available to us and looking across a number of different incidents and a campaign that's stretched over a number of years, we're as confident as we can be that China is responsible for this campaign and for those attacks. So we...
Expressing frustration over stalled nuclear talks, Kim said his country was no longer bound by a moratorium on nuclear and missile tests. The suspension had been at the center of diplomacy between North Korea and the United States. Kim accused the US of hostility, but he left the door open to further talks with the Trump administration.
Well, the international community has reacted with alarm at the sharp rise in tensions between the US and Iran. China has appealed for restraint from all sides, especially the United States, following the killing of Iranian commander there, Qasem Soleimani.
Every year, Human Rights Watch produces an annual report detailing the most oppressive places on Earth. This is not where this year's report was supposed to be launched. With a focus this year on China, they planned to be in Hong Kong, but the head of the organisation, Ken Roth, was barred entry.
Sadly, as I arrived here, the Chinese government decided it didn't want to let me in. So even though I've been able to enter Hong Kong freely before, this time, for the first time, they blocked me.
Instead, he flew to the UN in New York, where he gave details of China's repression that perhaps the authorities there didn't want the world to hear. It goes beyond violence against protesters in Hong Kong and the detention camps in Xinjiang.
This is the most severe period of repression that we've seen in decades in China, probably going back to the Cultural Revolution or an era like that. Xinjiang is the worst, where 1 million or more Uyghur and Turkic Muslims are in detention for forced indoctrination, basically to pressure them to renounce Islam and their cultural traditions and even their language.
At the end of the news conference, a Chinese diplomat who'd been sitting at the back of the room came to the front to condemn Human Rights Watch.
The report is full of prejudices and fabrications and ignore the factual information provided by my government repeatedly for all these years.
This supervision is much more intrusive, it's much more intensive.
1 in every 3 Christians in Asia are suffering from a high level of persecution. That's according to a new report by the UK-based Christian advocacy group Open Doors. Its 2019 watch list report ranks these 4 Asian countries among the top 10 where persecutions of Christians is most extreme. North Korea tops the list for the 18th straight year. The report says there have been increased efforts by the government to eliminate all channels for spreading Christianity. The report also highlights the continued persecution of Christian minorities in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are predominantly Muslim. And for the first time, India has broken into the top 10 of the watch list due to a rising numbers of attacks on Christians and churches by Hindu extremists. China is also on the list, ranked at number 27 this year, a dramatic rise from its position at number 43 in 2018. The report says, according to some church leaders, persecution in China is at the worst level since the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s. Other Asian countries on the list include Myanmar, Vietnam, Bhutan, Indonesia, and Malaysia.
Perhaps one of the most significant shifts is that responsibility for the supervision of religious activity has shifted to the party organization called the United Front Work Department and away from a government department that was called the Religious Affairs Bureau. That's been done away with. Now this supervision is much more intrusive, it's much more intensive, and it's a way of making sure that all religion, not just Christianity, has to serve the ideological goals of the state and under.
There is anger in Iran after authorities admit to mistakenly shooting down the passenger plane that killed 176 people on board. Crowds in Tehran are calling on its leaders to step down, sparking renewed anti-government protests in the country. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is supporting the protesters, sending out a controversial tweet in Farsi. This while Washington continues to return the maximum pressure to a country already riddled with sanctions.
After those missile attacks, a passenger plane crashed in Iran, killing all 176 people on board. The Ukrainian jet, a Boeing 737, going down shortly after takeoff, and an investigation is underway.
More than 170 people dying in a plane crash there overnight. You can see lumps of the burning wreckage scattered by the Boeing 737 passenger jet. It had just left Iran, bound for Ukraine, possibly catching fire shortly after takeoff. There were no Americans on board, but among the 176 victims are at least 82 Iranians and 63 Canadians. Investigators are scouring fields of smouldering debris near the airport where it came down. They've retrieved a black box, but as yet they haven't announced a cause. Initially, the Ukrainian embassy in Iran blamed a mechanical failure, but their government retracted that statement, although they do now say they're not considering any pilot error. Flight radar shows the plane never made it above 8,000 feet, and it was delayed for almost an hour before leaving. Now, Ukrainian international airlines say the plane last had a maintenance check on Monday, and they've suspended all flights to Tehran indefinitely.
So many questions remain unanswered. These foreign ministers wanted to emphasize publicly how they believe Iran should respond to the killing of 167 people on board an Ukrainian airliner 2 weeks ago.
The Iranian government has accepted full responsibility, but when you accept full responsibility, there's consequences coming from that, and that's what we're going to be pursuing.
After a meeting between the foreign ministers of Canada, the Netherlands, Sweden, Ukraine, Afghanistan and Britain, they announced their 5 key requests to Iran's authorities. They include full and unhindered access to consular services, bodies to be identified with dignity and transparency according to international standards, an independent and transparent investigation, for Iran to recognize a duty of care to victims' families, including compensation, and an independent criminal investigation and impartial judicial proceedings.
The 4th key element of what the foreign ministers agreed in the Canadian embassy is, with Iran assuming responsibility for downing the airliner, the key question then is the duty of care to the families of the victims, and that includes compensation. The critical question then is just how much compensation.
Earlier, a commemoration was held in the Canadian embassy, but what happens next in Iran is far more important. Canada's leader, Justin Trudeau, has spoken of the hurt and frustration of victims' families in Iran and says the protests during the past few weeks should be heeded very carefully by the Iranian government. His main obligation is to the 57 Canadian passport holders who were killed.
I am hurt like all Canadians. I am angry like all Canadians. But unlike many people, I actually have a job to do that is going to be able to help these families directly. Getting answers for them is my entire focus right now.
Saying in the past, and we continue saying, that we regret the U.S. decision to withdraw from the deal. And we continue believing that this deal is a key element of the global nuclear non-proliferation architecture and critical for the regional stability.
Germany is convinced that Iran shouldn't acquire or have nuclear weapons. For this reason, we will continue to employ all diplomatic means to keep this agreement alive. It is certainly not perfect, but it is an agreement, and it comprises commitments by all sides.
Together, we have made clear our regret and concern at the decision by the United States to withdraw from the JCPOA and to reimpose sanctions on Iran.
Let's try and drill down even further on this story by examining what our government seems to cherish and protect more than just about anything else: the U.S. dollar and its exclusive relationship with oil and how it's traded. You see, back in 1970, the term petrodollar was actually invented, essentially branding and solidifying that henceforth every drop of oil recovered anywhere on Earth would always be measured and traded in U.S. dollars. No other currency, only the dollar. And no country was more important to that deal, still is, by the way, than Saudi Arabia. But what if that deal went away? What would be the impact? Not only are you the host of Boom Bust, the best business show on television, but you also have experience dealing not only on the trading floor, but specifically on the trading floor as it relates to oil. Mm-hmm. So this is the most important, this petrodollar question. And again, the question is, if Iran was making overtures toward Saudi Arabia or vice versa, and they came together, experts are saying one of the things that could suffer in that deal is the petrodollar deal. Why is that so important? Make us understand that.
It was because the entire petrodollar link, all the oil that's traded globally is currently pegged to the US dollar, is denominated in the US dollar. And this was, as you said, done in the 1970s. So because of that, the entire commodities market, as well as all imports, exports, they are all currently denominated in US dollar. One reason is because the US dollar is currently the world's currency reserve.
Right.
And how did it get there? Well, one could argue which came first, the chicken or egg. Did they become the currency reserve first, or is it because of their monopoly on the commodities market that gave them the power to become the currency reserve of the world? We don't know, but oil accounts for up 2 to 4% of GDP in worldwide trade. And that is something substantial. So if you control the oil market, the commodities energy flow, that's something that every single country needs as an import, then that is going to be huge. And that makes every single country dependent on the US dollar.
I would imagine if I was an American neocon, an American banker, business person, I would be so concerned about this, because let us suppose that the Saudis decide to get back together with Iran, and somewhere in the process they start seeing themselves not as a vassal of the United States, but really part of a bigger world sort of thing, and they say, you know what, we're going to pull out of that petrodollar deal. That lets the genie out of the bottle, because suddenly China may have the same idea and say, we don't want to use the dollar either. Russia could step in and say, we don't want to use the dollar either. Certainly Venezuela.
Actually, they've already done so.
Really?
They've already done so. In the past year, China, Russia, as well as India, they have been lowering their US dollar reserve because they no longer want to deal with the US dollar hegemony, their monopoly on trade, essentially, that all trade must be denominated in dollar. So because of that, China and Russia have already started trading commodities and as well as other exports in their own currencies, the ruble and the RMB. And it makes perfect sense for the countries to use their own currencies. So Russia also traded with India, and they successfully completed their trades in 2019. Venezuela and Iran. Venezuela wants to move to their own Petro coin, which is a blockchain cryptocurrency denominated in oil that they're currently using to get around the US dollar as well. So these individual countries, they all want to use their own currency. They no longer think it's fair or it's needed to use the US dollar.